Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Adobe FrameMaker Essentials webinar series. This is part 10 of the series, and our topic for today is on understanding anchored objects. My name is Barb, and I'll be your host for the next hour or so. I'm the owner and lead instructor at Rocky Mountain Training, and I've been offering classes on FrameMaker since the early 90s. I'm also an Adobe community expert, which means that I've been vetted by Adobe to answer questions on the community forums. And if you haven't been to the FrameMaker forum yet, it's definitely a place you want to go. I'll give you a link in just a minute. You'll see me there answering questions most days. If you'd like to stay in touch, take a screenshot of this page. You've got my email and my website, but you'll also have the URL for my Rocky Mountain Training blog. I started that blog in 2009 as a way of answering student questions that came to me after they completed a class. There are years of my FrameMaker students' questions and then my answers on FrameMaker. And it also shows you how to get to the Adobe Community Forums, which is probably the best place to go to find answers these days. The URL is community.adobe.com. If you scroll down, you'll find Adobe FrameMaker. Click on Discussions and then go ahead and bookmark that page. This also has years of past questions and answers from users from all over the world, and you can also ask your own questions there as well. These are both free resources meant to support you in your FrameMaker adventures. So the topic for today is working with anchored objects. FrameMaker has two kinds of anchored objects. It has anchored tables and anchored frames. Anchored objects are going to flow through the document as you edit your content. If you have a sentence that says, for more information, see figure 1.1 below, you want to make sure it's below that paragraph and doesn't end up a few pages earlier in the file. The way that we control how tables and frames move through our document is through anchors, and they're a little mysterious. In many cases, people that are using FrameMaker know one way of anchoring and only one way because that's the way they've been taught. There are lots of ways to control these anchors, and that's what I want to talk about. I'll start with tables, then I'll cover anchored frames, and then I'm going to combine them together because you can use them either independently or together for different effects. Let's go ahead and start with anchored tables. So in layout, we tend to use tables to present data that does not read well organized in the middle of a paragraph. Tables let us work with rows and columns to present structured and organized information. And I'd like to review the table components and terminology I'll be using so you can follow my instructions. I'm going to throw in a couple of long document table commands that you might find helpful but have overlooked so far in your FrameMaker career, and then focus on the table positioning controls, which is why we're here today. So this is Adobe FrameMaker 2022. This is the current version as of today's recording. There's nothing I'll be talking about during this webinar that's unique to 2022. If you're using an older version of FrameMaker, you can still do what I'm going to be showing you over the course of this hour. I want to go to page 7 because I have a table in this document. And what I'd like to do is just break out the components first and go over the terminology. So I'd like you to notice that there is an anchor at the end of this line right here. To make it easier to see, I'll zoom in a bit. And an anchor is an upside down T. As I said, FrameMaker has two kinds of anchors that it supports. It has anchored tables and anchored frames. The anchors themselves look identical. They're upside down T's, they don't print. And the default for both of those objects is to anchor below the current line. So if you see an anchor and you're thinking, is that a table anchor or a figure anchor? You could look right underneath it probably and say, oh, I bet that's a table anchor. And of course, that's what this one is. Now, the idea behind an anchor is it allows the tables and frames to reflow through the document as you are making edits. So if somebody comes along and says, hey, you forgot a paragraph, go ahead and add a missing paragraph in, and I'll simulate that by pressing enter, enter, enter. As you add content, FrameMaker forces the content after your cursor down, which moves the anchor down, which moves the table down. And as I press backspace, backspace, backspace to remove content, it pulls it all back up again. That is the whole point of an anchored object. Everything else I'll be talking about is variations on that theme. So we'll take a look at what that looks like. But first, let me just go over some basic table terminology and throw in a couple of commands about tables that you might have missed along the way. As a trainer, I know what people all know, what people often don't know. So I'm always trying to fill in the gaps with those things that people overlook. Okay, so the anchor is right here. Now, the second thing you see on screen is this right here, which is the table title. And tables have table styles, but the text inside the table has paragraph styles assigned. And so this is actually using a paragraph style called TC table caption. You can see it down here. You can also see it in bold in my catalog. A table can have a title above or below or no title at all. That's handled through the table style. So we've got paragraph styles and table styles working together to produce this table. More terminology, rows go across, columns go down. Where they intersect, we have a cell. Body rows encompass the bulk of the table. That's where all the content is. But FrameMaker also supports heading and footing rows. A heading row typically is going to identify the contents of the columns, and it's used in most tables. So I can tell at a glance that these are the years, these are the awards, and these are the departments that receive the awards just by looking at that heading row. A footing row is a possibility in FrameMaker. They're not used that often, though. Some people do, but a lot of people just don't use footing rows. They repeat at the bottom of a table. And table titles and heading and footing rows are all going to repeat if a table goes to a second or subsequent page. Now, before I show that to you, let me just quickly cover the sort command in case you missed it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make a selection of the body rows in the table. And they're currently sorted numerically in ascending order. I'm going to sort them alphabetically by the department just by going to the table menu and picking sort. If you haven't noticed this command before, it's been there for a while. All you need to do is figure out what you want to sort. In this case, I want to sort the body rows. What column you want to sort by, I'll pick column 3, and I want to sort in ascending alphabetical order. And when I click sort, they're now in alphabetical order. Now, to put them back in numerical order, I can just go back to table sort, and I can say, now I want to sort the body rows by column 1 and sort, and now they're back in the original order. Easy enough, just in case you missed it. Now, what I'd like to do is have a longer table so I can talk about some of the things that pertain to the multi-page tables. So to get there quickly, I'm just going to copy my selected body rows, and I'm going to paste these exact rows 2 times after the last row. I'll do one with paste, and then insert below current row, and I'll do one more and be right back. Okay, so I've now made this table longer than it was when it first came in. And I'm going to zoom out so that you can see that it actually spans 2 pages. If you can see, there is a table title at the top that is repeating. The heading rows are repeating. And I'd like to cover the table variables just in case you missed these because they are so easy to add these days. If my cursor at the end of my table title, I'm going to go to my table menu. I'm going to insert table variables. And I'll go ahead and insert both at the same time, but I'm doing 2 separate features here. A table continuation variable puts the word continued on the second and subsequent pages of a table, not on the first page, on the second and subsequent pages. And then the table sheet count is going to give you what sheet you're on within the table and how many it has. I'm going to turn them both on and hit insert. And then let's break it down. The first thing you're going to see is this little tiny symbol. It's a little square U, and I know it must be very small on the preview. But if you come down here, you can see it put continued on the second page. That was the first variable. The second variable is the sheet count. This is a 2-page table, so it says sheet 1 of 2, and then it says sheet 2 of 2. And these are both meant to help somebody realize when they're opening up a document to the middle of a table that they're not on the first page of the table, because sometimes it looks like they are. These are super easy to work with, and I use them. Now, I don't know that you need to have both, and I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the sheet count. and then I'll hit refresh, which is Control L, and that's going to just leave the word continued on the second and subsequent pages. But you can use one or the other or both or none, completely up to you. Now, before I continue, I'm looking at something you probably haven't noticed yet, but I'm not loving it. There actually isn't a line at the bottom of the table. You might not see it very well, so let me make it easier. I'm going to go to the View menu and hide the borders, and now you can probably tell that there's not a line under this particular row. Now, there is a line at the bottom of the entire table, but not one on the first page of the table, and that's a table designer feature. Tables are controlled by table styles. The styles are listed over in your catalog, but the style definitions are handled in Table Designer. And you've got different categories here to work through. Basic, ruling, and shading are the three primary categories. Basic has the spacing commands as well as the anchored object positions and whether the titles are there or not. Then we have ruling properties and shading properties. Ruling properties is the problem I'm looking at. It says only draw the bottom ruling on the last sheet. I'm going to say, nope, I want it on the whole thing. I want a line right there. So when I update style, it shows up, which I think looks better. So I'm happy with that. I think that's good. And then just a little bit more on working with styles, table styles. I have two table styles in this particular template. I'm using table bordered, but there's also one called table shaded. And you can see how quickly I can format my table just by clicking the style name. All of this is handled in the table designer. You set up your tables the way you want them to look, and then one click is going to do that for you. That's the idea. Okay, so now let's talk about the anchoring positions in a longer table. I'm going to zoom out. And you can see that my table spans two different pages. Part of it's on page 7 and part's on page 8. Sometimes people don't like tables breaking across pages, and you can handle that one of two ways. If potentially you want this row down at the bottom to stay with the row that follows, and you care about the rows themselves, not the entire table, you can do that at the row level. In the table menu under Format, there's something called row formatting. Again, this is row level commands. We could say, hey, I want to keep you with the next row. And when I click Set, those two have to stay together, and the one I had selected has moved down. That's helpful. Another option, though, is to do it at the table level. And back in the Table Designer, under Basic Properties, we can get a rough idea of how many rows we're working with. And I'm going to say we have under 30 rows. And then put an orphan row number that's larger than the table. So if I put in 50, because I don't think we have 50 rows, and I update style, FrameMaker tries to keep the entire table together. And you can see that it's all on one page, and it all fit comfortably on one page, which is great. You might not like where it's sitting, though, and the fact that it left this great big gap right here. Now, before I deal with the gap, let me just show you a few ways to control the table position. Under Table Designer, in Basic Properties, there's a menu that says Start. And Start Anywhere actually means be below the anchor. And that's exactly what's happening right now. There's the anchor. The table is below the anchor, but because it was told to stay together and it can't fit below the anchor, the whole thing goes to the next page. Just want you to see what that looks like. And what I'd like to do to show the other ones is actually set the orphan rows back to, let's say, 2 again. I'll update style. And then you could tell the table, without telling it to keep the lines together, just where you want it to be on the page. You could say, hey, I want you to start at the top of the page. This is going to take us to the same place I just took you to with the orphan rows, but now we're giving it a table positioning command. You're controlling that anchored object. That's top of page. You could also say you want to go to the top of a left page, which is going to leave that right page blank. Or you could say go to the top of a right page, which will come back to where it was a second ago. Those are all different versions of the start position for that table. Now, what I'm going to do is tell it to be anywhere and then go back to having my orphan rows set to 50, which is more than the rows in the table, which means it's going to stay right where it is, but I'm doing it now with the rows and not with the start, because I want to show you this gap right here and explain what you can do about that gap. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down to the heading that is underneath the table. It comes after that table. And I'm just going to change it to red as an override. So I'm going to go to color. I'll go find red. I'm going to click apply. Now that's a red heading. And I'm going to scroll back. Here we go. There is another table designer control for tables that I like to use, and I use it in almost all my documents. It's called float. And people don't seem to understand what float does, so let me show you. If you tell that table it's allowed to float, but you've also told it it's got to keep all those lines together, float, and then updating the style is going to let the text that used to be after the table float back up and fill in that space so you don't get that big gap. I think that's a great thing. Now, I definitely have students who say, well, I need my table to be exactly below my anchor. In that case, they really want to use Start Anywhere. But I don't feel that way. I feel like if it says below, or if someone's looking for the table, they're going to look on the page they're on and the next couple of pages. That's where they're going. As long as it's on the next page, I am fine with that. And most of my clients are too, once I explain that concept. So that's the idea of float. FrameMaker actually backfills. If I turn float off and I put it back to anywhere, you can see now that it's underneath the table. When I turn it back on again, it backfills up and fills that area and then puts the table there, which I think is great. So I reverted back to the smaller table just to show a technique that I used for print or for PDF output. This is not going to work great if you're exporting to HTML because the tables will be in the wrong position. But when I have back-to-back tables or table graphic, or some other combination, I'll often use that float, but then I'll move the anchors so I can get these to be at the top of the pages. Now it's a combination of moving the anchors and floating. Let me go ahead and turn float on this one. So I'm back in Table Designer. I'm in Basic Properties. I'm setting my Start to Float, Update Style, and it didn't do anything at all because it's already just sitting here self-contained. But what I can do now is select my anchor. And selecting an anchor is actually difficult, especially if there's a period on one side and the return marker on the other. You might find it quicker to do that, not by going after the anchor, but just by using the Select Table button up here. And then I'm going to choose Cut, and I'm going to zoom out. And the table was sitting right in the middle here. If I've got stacked tables and graphics or table, whatever the combination is, I might put the anchor earlier than expected. So I'll put it over here and I'll hit paste. And float puts it at the top of the page. If I have another one, I can click and I could paste it again. Let's pretend it's a different table because it is, of course, the same table. And you can see how they are staying at the top of the page because I put my anchor where it wouldn't fit down here. It's floating, it moves up, and everything else just kind of moves out of the way. This is something I use quite a bit in my print and PDF distribution FrameMaker documents. Now, if I turn float back off again, it doesn't work as well. I want to show you that. So I'll go back and turn off float and pick anywhere, update style. And now it needs to be directly under that anchor. And with the keep with next on the earlier paragraphs, all that text comes over with it. And now it's sitting in the middle of the page. There are times when I want to have the graphics and the tables at the top of all the pages. Float is just another way to get there that you might not have thought about. So let's go ahead and talk about anchored frames. Anchored frames are the other type of anchored objects in Adobe FrameMaker. Anchored frames typically contain a linked graphic, and just like anchored tables, they will move through the document while you're editing. I'd like to go over the two correct ways to add an image to an anchored frame, go over the frame components so you understand the terminology I'm using. I'll look at a few ways of resizing the graphic in the frame, and then we're going to focus on all the various frame positions. And there are a lot more frame positions for anchored frames than there are for anchored tables. So we're back in FrameMaker. Let's take a look at the two ways to add a linked graphic to an anchored frame in FrameMaker. I'm going to go ahead and add it to page 2. Now, before I start, I need to get my page 2 active. And there's two ways of doing that. If I click in the margin, that makes the page active. Importing a graphic right now would not go into an anchored frame. It would go onto the page. And a page anchor graphic doesn't move unless you move it. That's more appropriate for graphics you're adding to the master pages. For example, this line you see up here, where you place it and you want it to stay exactly there unless you come along later and reposition it. Anchored frames are meant to move with the edits, and you need an insertion point to add an anchored frame. So I'm going to go ahead and click at the end of this line right here. My cursor is blinking. I know it's a little bit small, but I've got a blinking cursor here. And that tells FrameMaker that when I go pick out a graphic, it's going to add it as an anchored frame. Two ways to add a graphic, neither of them is edit paste or any variation of using paste. If you want the graphic to be linked, and you do because it keeps the frame size smaller and lets you edit it outside of the program, then you want to go to either the Insert menu and pick Image. This is the newer command. It was added in 2017. If you pick Insert Image and you pick the graphic that you want, in this case, I want to have the wide spaceship, then it's going to be linked automatically. It doesn't ask you. I'm just going to pick Open. It's going to anchor below the insertion point because that's the default, and it's a linked graphic. You can see three things appeared where my cursor was. There is an anchor sitting exactly at my cursor position, looks just like a table anchor, and they work the same way. The whole idea behind an anchor is the anchored objects flow as you edit the text. And then FrameMaker went ahead and added a frame, and it added a graphic inside the frame. That's one technique. I'm going to choose Undo. If you're in my office looking over my shoulder, you're much more likely to see me go to File, Import File for the exact same command, or even more likely to just tap Escape FIF, because that's a shortcut I like to use. And this is simply an old dogs, new tricks issue. I've been using FrameMaker for a long time. This is ingrained in my workflow. I think File, Import File when I think, oh, I need a graphic or text or spreadsheet or whatever. So I'm going to just go to File, Import File. But when I pick the same graphic, spaceship wide, I want to make sure it's linked. Copy means it's going to be embedded, and the FrameMaker file gets bigger. We link our graphics. Then it's going to look exactly the same as the one I brought in through Insert Image. Same thing. There's my anchor, there's my frame, and there's my graphic. Now, the whole point of this is if you begin to edit the document, the text will reflow, the anchor will reflow, and the anchored frame or the anchored table will flow with it. As I remove those extra edits, it goes back to where it was. The graphic will be sitting automatically inside of the anchored frame, and there's a few different ways that you can resize it. One technique is just to grab a random handle and do whatever you want, which is going to distort the graphic and not a good option. You can see it doesn't look great. I'll undo that. If you want to resize the graphic manually, that's fine. Just hold the Shift key as you do the same thing, and that will maintain the aspect ratio. The same ratio for width and height as it scales down or scales up will be maintained, and it will not look distorted. That's the Shift key. Alternatively, you could have the graphic selected, and you could head up to the graphics menu and you could pick Scale. You can scale by percentage factor. Maybe you want this to be half the size that it is right now. If I type in 50% and I hit Scale, it's now half the size that it was. I'll hit Undo. Or in Graphics menu Scale, we can give it a very specific width or height. Now, there's a check mark up top you're going to want to turn on. It says Preserve Aspect Ratio. If you leave that off and you change the width, the height won't change. It's going to look squished. So you want to turn it on, and then you can give it a very specific size. If I want that to be 1 inch wide, and I type in a 1, the height is going to adjust accordingly so that as I pick Scale, it's 1 inch wide, and then the height has reduced so that it maintains that same aspect ratio. Also notice the frame does not follow along on this job. The frame is just sitting still. You adjust the graphic and then tell the frame to catch up. So I'm going to make the graphic now the size I actually want, which is the width of this main column. I know this file, and I know that the distance from this column edge right here all the way to this one is 5¼ inches. So I'll go to graphics. I'm going to pick scale. I'm going to give it a width of 5.25. And when I click scale, it now is going to go across the whole page. Now, if you have good eyes, you might be looking and saying, you know, Barb, you're a little short on the left and the right. It's true. Now, my graphic is sized correctly, but my frame was not moving along with the graphic. It was just staying still. And so now I need to make the frame bigger. Two ways to do that. I can select the frame and I can adjust it myself by tugging on the handles. And by the way, this goes both directions. I can make the frame bigger by doing that, but I could also make the frame smaller. And let me just detour for a second and show you that to you. Let's say all I want to show people is the moon. If I make the frame small enough that only the moon is visible, that is a possibility. So I could make it so I just see the moon, let's crop it a bit more. And making the frame smaller than the graphic is how we can crop something. But in our case, I really want the frame to match the graphic. And there is a shortcut for that. Now, it's a two-step short or two-level shortcut. One shortcut does two things. And before I show this to you, I'm going to open up the anchored frame panel. I am going to be talking to you about anchoring positions. We did this with the tables. Now we're going to look at them for frames. There are more anchoring positions for frames than there are for tables, so more to discuss here. It's currently set to below current line. Now, I've got this cropped graphic and a small frame, and I want the frame to be the same size as my graphic. The shortcut is Escape, M as in make, P as in pretty. And what happens when I do that is FrameMaker makes the frame match the size of the graphic. And so now it's successfully spanning the main column from left to right, which is great. But as I said, it's a two-step shortcut. So it's done that, but it also anchored the frame at insertion point. It happens to look okay just because of luck, no other reason. Because it didn't fit on that line, it's now still sitting underneath it, but it's not going to be okay. I really want to change my anchoring position back to below current line. And when I do that, you'll see the anchor show up here again, and it's going to be sitting right below the anchor, just like it was. But I found a great way to resize the frame quickly to match the graphic. I'm all about speed and efficiency in FrameMaker. I talk about that in every single webinar, how I want to get my work done so I can go outside and play. Every day, that's what I'm thinking about. And I am perfectly happy to change the anchoring position to whatever I want after I get the frame to match, because that's a quick way to do it. So I'll come back and discuss at insertion point in a more traditional situation in a little bit. But for now, this looks pretty good. And from here, let's talk about some other anchoring positions. So what I'm going to do is go to a fit page in window view, and I'm currently anchored below current line. Maybe I think this should be at the top of the page. So what I can do is come over here to anchoring positions and choose at top of column, and then click edit frame. It looks awkward because the alignment is set to center, and this is a side head format, so it just looks strange where it's sitting. I could say, well, I think I want you on the left-hand side, and it will go to the left of the frame. Or in this case, it would be much better. I think it was on the right-hand side, and it can go to that right edge of the frame. Or I could say, I want you to be anchored at the bottom of the column, and I'll just keep it on the right and edit frame. And now it's sitting at the bottom. Now the anchor is still right here at the top. And if you are going to anchor at top or bottom of column, it's not going to move unless the anchor moves to the next page. Let me zoom out, and what I'm going to do is start to press the enter key. Again, my anchor is right here above the subhead overview. That graphic is not going to move until I force the anchor to the next page. I'm about there. So when the anchor goes to the next page, the graphic goes with it, and it sits at the bottom of that column. There's actually a footnote there, so it's right above the footnote, but it's following those rules. And if I undo to remove all the returns, it's going to come back to the bottom of that column. Okay, so I'm back and I'm going to place this frame. If I can select it, there we go, um, below the current line and choose Edit Frame. Now, the issue with below current line is that it's hard to control the spacing. One technique you can use is you can grab the top of the frame, make it a little bit taller, and that will push the graphic down and add some space. But if you've got 300 graphics, that's a manual technique, and B, you won't be consistent. Let me undo that and show you what a lot of people do in their FrameMaker documentation. They take that anchor and they add it to its own paragraph. And I'm going to do that by just pressing the Enter key. Now, keep in mind, there are two things on this new line. There's an anchor, which doesn't print, and a pilcrow, which doesn't print. So that's not a printable object. It's just controlling the spacing. And most people are going to find that they've got a style in their paragraph catalog that is specifically for anchors. If I go ahead and click on Anchor Image, it's going to make that a tiny anchor, so small we can't see it. It's 2 points. So tiny anchor, tiny pilcrow, but now letting that anchor control the spacing. And if I decide that of my 300 images that are all sitting on a style called Anchor Image, that I need more space, I can just go to my paragraph designer and I can go to basic properties and I could add space above the paragraph. Maybe I want to make it 24 and update style. And it's going to change that for the entire document. If I think, wow, that's really way too much, I don't think I want any extra spacing, I can put it back to 0, update style. Again, that's rolling through the entire document. And you can import that formatting change to the other chapters in your book so it rolls through your entire book. This is all about working efficiently. Now, another feature of FrameMaker is the ability to tell FrameMaker what paragraph style should follow a specific paragraph. So if I'm on Anchor Image, you can see here in Basic Properties that if I press Enter, a figure caption style is going to be assigned automatically. So I'm going to go ahead and just press the Enter key. And you can see that the figure style appears directly underneath, and I'm going to type in Personal Spaceship as my caption. One more thing to think about with paragraph styles, you would never want the picture to be on a different page from the caption. And so you will typically want to select your caption style and make sure it's set to keep with the previous paragraph. That is a command in the paragraph designer under pagination properties, keep with previous paragraph. And that means that if Personal Spaceship and the paragraph before it, which is the one called Anchor Image that contains this image, can't both fit at the bottom of this page, they both have to go to the next page. They have to move together. So that's what that's all about. So from here, I'd like to go into some other anchor frame positions to show you some more examples of what you can do. This is a long list. We've talked about below current line, at top and bottom of column. I want to cover these other ones next. And so I'm going to head over to another page in the document. And what I'd like to do is replace the words primary control with a picture of a controller. So I'm going to put my cursor right here in front of primary control, and I can go to File, Import File, or Insert Image. And I'm going to go ahead and bring in my picture of a controller. Import by reference and import. And it's going to, as a default, anchor below the current line. Now it's a little bit bigger than I want it to be, so I'm going to scale it down. Let me give it a scale value of 50%, so it's half the size it is right now. And then I'm going to shrink wrap it, and that is Escape, M as in make, P as in pretty. It's going to make it an inline graphic. Now, the last time I did that, I did it strictly because I wanted the frame to be smaller. But this time I want it to be a traditional inline graphic. So if I select that frame, I can push it down a little bit so it sits better on that line. And a traditional inline graphic means if I start adding text, it's going to move along with the edits, not just up and down like the other frames, but it's actually going to move left and right like a word. I'm going to undo that. And then I don't need the words primary control, so I'm going to delete those. We'll pretend that this indicates that primary controller, and that's what I want. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this. and I'm going to just replace primary control with that graphic. I've covered object styles in other webinars. This is a good thing for an object style, so not a bad idea to go ahead and create an object style for it. And that way, if somebody says, hey, it's too high or too low, you need to make some kind of a modification. You could control all those at once. But again, the idea of an inline graphic is it doesn't just move up and down the page, it moves left and right like it's a word. So that's another anchoring position, and this is a traditional use of an inline graphic. So I backed up to where I had just placed the graphic underneath the step 1 primary control dialog box, and I showed you anchoring at insertion point. I'm going to leave it at this size and show you another anchoring position. In this case, what I'd like to do is go over to the anchoring position and ask it to be outside the column on that left-hand side. And when I click Edit Frame, that's where it goes. I think it's a little bit close and a little bit high, so I'm going to hold the Alt key to nudge it left a bit and down a bit. I'll put it something like this. And then if I select that frame and I copy it, I could paste it in the margin as a way to get the reader's attention to go read about that primary controller. It's a different way of getting their eye to move over. And if I were to edit this text, this is going to move up and down the page and from page to page as I am manipulating the content. And now I'm on page 1, and I want to put in a drop cap. Now keep in mind, we don't use a lot of drop caps in technical documents, so this is not actually a feature built into FrameMaker, but you can do it with an anchored frame. What I want is a great big T here that drops into the paragraph, and it's manual. So I'm going to have to get rid of the T and then insert a graphic that I've already added to my folder that has a big T in there. I'll go to File, Import File. I'm using the shortcut Escape FIF. I've got a graphic called T. I'll pick Import. And its sizing, I think, is fine, but you can see it's anchored below the current line and it's set to center. So I'm going to change it to anchor so that it runs into paragraph. And I'll give it a gap of 2 points. Maybe I could even get away with less because there's space around the outside of that frame. Let's try that. That's fine. And actually, I think I want it to be Escape MP. My frame's too big, and I'll try that again. Now I'm going to anchor it, run into paragraph. That's better. And that's how I can create a drop cap. Now, I did want to talk about how you can replace an image. So let me go ahead and show you 2 ways to do that. The first one is File, Import File. If you have an image selected, and then you go to File, Import File, I'm going to use my shortcut, Escape, FIF. I've got another image that has an alien holding a sign with a T. It's not going to read as well as my letter T, but I want to have a little fun here, so I'll hit Replace. And you can see that the T is gone, and I replaced the image with an alien and a little T. Actually, I can't undo that. Remember that you can undo a lot of things in FrameMaker, but some commands don't let you hit undo. It clears history. That was one of those. So I just had to stop and put the T back in again so I can show you the other technique. The other technique is in Object Properties. And you might not know this one. If you knew the other one, that's great. But this is one that's less known probably. In Object Properties, you can come in here and you can set up the file that you're linking to. So if I hit Browse and I want that alien again, key with alien, I'll pick Open, and then he comes in. And then I'll just use my Shift key to resize him so he fills it up. Doesn't read as well as just a T by itself, but I was actually playing with the Adobe artificial intelligence commands. All these graphics I generated in Adobe Illustrator with text to graphic, just trying to learn that feature and incorporating it into this so it's a little bit more fun. I know you're not going to ever have an alien. Oh, well, I don't know what you're ever going to have, but probably not going to have any aliens in your documentation. Well, maybe. We'll find out, right? Okay, I keep talking about the default being placing an anchored frame directly below the current line. I do want to show you where to control that. So I'm going to head over to page 4. And I'm going to click at the end of a paragraph, and I'm going to use File, Import File, or Escape FIF as my shortcut. I'll throw in a spaceship graphic, and as always, it begins anchored below the current line. That's just a reminder. I'm going to hit undo. Then I'm going to go to a fit page and window view so you can see the entire page. And do notice that these graphics are anchored to the text. They're going to move when I add this new graphic. So I'll keep my cursor in the same location. It's going to be at the end of that first paragraph, but I'm going to then go change the default. So I'll go to Edit, Preferences. In the left column, there's a preference category called Graphics, and this is why it keeps anchoring below current line. You don't have access to all the anchoring positions, but you have access to the primary anchoring positions. And let's say I wanted to always anchor at the bottom of the column. That's my standard. I want at the bottom of whatever page the anchor is on, and I want it to be on the right side at the bottom of the page of whatever the anchor is on. If I click OK, I don't get a graphic. I've simply told FrameMaker, hey, the next time I add a graphic, until I modify the position, this is where it's supposed to go. So again, Escape FIF is my shortcut for File, Import File. I'm going to double click the graphic I want, and this time it goes automatically to the bottom of the page. I can control that default. I did want to scroll down just show you those are the graphics move because that's their job. And then I've also mentioned that one of the reasons we use linked graphics is because it keeps the FrameMaker file small, which is fabulous. But the other thing about the linked graphics is it means you can edit these files in the source program. And then if you come back to FrameMaker, you'll see those edits reflected. So I'm going to zoom in just a little bit so you can see my spaceship. And you can see I've got these empty windows, no pilots in here. So what I want to do is edit this image, which I created in Illustrator. I'm going to right click it and I'll pick Edit With from the bottom of the right click menu. I'll go ahead and choose Illustrator, which is going to open up my copy of Illustrator and open up this file and allow me to edit it. And you can see that I have a layers panel over here, and I have two layers that are currently hidden. I have an alien in the bottom window who's looking at you, and I've got another one in the top window who's waving hello. All of this was using the text to vector prompt in Adobe Illustrator. I just described what I wanted, and these are the images that it came up with, which was lots of fun for me. And then I'm going to save it and return to FrameMaker. And I'll just wait for a minute before the aliens show up in the windows. FrameMaker will look over relatively quickly. There they go. I had to click it, but there they go. And now that's an edited image. And that's really helpful when you're doing technical drawings and you see a problem. You can right click to jump in, make some changes, save the file, come back to FrameMaker, and FrameMaker picks up those edits. Okay, so that completes a look at the anchored frames. We already covered anchored tables. Let's talk about combining them together. So let's wrap up by looking at combining tables and anchored frames to see how they can be used together. I've got three examples for you. One is adding a table inside an anchored frame, how and why. The second one is working with an image and a caption combination in a table. And finally, an alert table with a referenced image inside. Let's go take a look. So for this first example, what I'm going to do is just copy a few rows from this table because it's here and I can grab them easily. And I'm going to put them into a small table, narrow table, that's going to sit on the right side of these paragraphs. In my layout, a lot of my tables are so wide, I'm struggling to get all of the columns to fit where they're legible. But sometimes you might have a small table, or I might have a small table that I want to have inset in a paragraph and have text run around it. That's not a feature of a table, but it is of an anchored frame. And so what I'll do is I'll copy these rows and put them in an anchored frame to let the text run around them. Here's how. I'm going to place my cursor at the beginning of this paragraph, and I'm going to head over to the anchored frame panel. It's set to run into paragraph. It's set to be on the left. It has a gap. It has a size, and I can change anything here, but I'll leave them as they are until I see what it looks like. And then for the first time, I see a button that says New Frame. And that's because up until now, whenever I've been in this panel, I've been modifying the frames that FrameMaker has drawn for us as we import graphics. This time, I haven't imported anything, so there's no frame there. This will actually add a new frame. And it shows up on the left side of this text. And I think that's okay, but I think I'd prefer to have it on the right. That's an easy fix. So I'll change it to the right side and I'll edit the frame and then potentially make it a little bit longer until I know how much space I need for this table. Now, what I want to do is copy this content and I want to paste it in this frame, but I can't because FrameMaker does not allow us to put text directly into an anchored frame. We can add graphics directly in, but text has to go inside a text frame. So I'm going to have to go over here to my toolbox and get the text frame tool, and then I'll add a text frame inside the anchored frame and hit set, and then I can paste in the content. And so here it is. Now I want to format it. So the first thing I'm going to do is make sure it knows it needs to be a table bordered because it's missing the table title. So if I reassign the style, it has space for a table title. And I can click up there and I can tell it that it needs to be a table caption. And I'll type the title in just a second. Right now, I'm more worried about the width of these columns. And so I can't get to the far side of my table to make it narrower. What I'll do is I'll just select a couple of cells and then use Control A, which is a shortcut for select all in table. And then I'm going to go to the table menu and I'm going to come down to resize columns and make them all the same width as column 1 because that's really narrow. And when I do that, you can see that the width of the table is now available to me. Now, I think the first column is probably fine. The second one is way too narrow, but this one is also a bit too narrow. So an easy way to fix that is to use the Shrinkwrap command. Up here on my table toolbar, it's the second to last button, it says Shrinkwrap column width. If I click it, it's going to make the column wide enough to accommodate the longest entry in that column. That looks better. And then I need to just make column 2 much wider. So I'm going to grab the sizing handle and just adjust it. That's pretty close. I think from here what I'll do is just select the whole table now and just drag it to the right edge of my text frame. I think that looks good. And then I want to go ahead and type in the table title. And after that, I just need to get everything to fit. Now, there's a great deal of space being taken up by the end of flow marker because that's the only thing in here, and the anchor. So, of course, one way to make it smaller is just to assign the anchor style we used on the page. That would make it smaller, but I still got some space to deal with. So here's another way to do this. I showed you how to crop an image. Well, that works with text too. If I grab that top middle handle and just pull it down to where I want the table to start, that takes care of that. So that looks good. Now I think it's a little bit too long, so I could pull that back up, something like this. And I think that works just fine. Now to help you see what's happening, I'll turn off the borders and the text symbols in just a second. But before I do that, I do want to address the table numbers. FrameMaker has correctly renumbered these tables. This was table 3 when I started. This is now table 3 because it appears above this table. And it's not just physically where it's sitting, but it's really where its anchor is sitting. As long as this anchor is ahead of this anchor, it's going to number 3, 4. If I move this anchor ahead of this one, then they're going to renumber again so that NASA is 3 and table inside an anchored frame is 4. It's all about the anchor order. It's all in flow A, so FrameMaker can keep track of that as long as you're paying attention to the anchor order. Where FrameMaker has trouble is when you have multiple flows. If you have flow A and flow B and flow C, and you're trying to number across them, you can't unless you get involved and do it manually. But it does work correctly, just like you want it to, if you're working with anchored frames, because they're in that same flow. And so to get a sense of what this is going to look like, I'm just going to go to the View menu, and I'll disable my borders and my text symbols. And you can see now that this particular table is inset into the paragraph and text flows around it. But still, as I begin to make modifications, everything just moves like it's supposed to, which is what we're all about with these anchors. So for my next example, I'm going to replace this figure caption combination with the same thing, but sitting inside a table. Now, why would we do that? Well, because sometimes we want to put both inside a border, and there's no easy way to accomplish that unless you use a table. Before I remove these, I just want to remind you that there's a tiny little paragraph sitting right here. It's using the style called anchor image, and I'm going to go ahead and click on body begin, which is bigger, so you can see it. We put that in earlier. And then I'm going to go ahead and just delete both of these paragraphs. I'm going to put them back in as a table, and my cursor is now sitting at the end of this paragraph. I'm not going to press enter and use anchor image because I don't need it. Unlike frames, which you cannot build spacing in above and below unless you use a paragraph style, table styles have spacing commands. You can control spacing above and below tables in a table style for the entire document or for an entire book. So I don't need to use it. I'm just going to go directly to the table menu and I'm going to pick Insert Table. I'm going to use the default format of table border that's on my data table that we worked with earlier. And then I'm going to ask for one column across, and I want one body row and one heading row. And that might seem like an odd choice to ask for a heading row when I'm going to have a self-contained table that's not going to spread across pages and have repeating information. But I'm doing that on purpose, and I'll show you why in just a second. I'm going to go ahead and click Insert, and the table appears below that anchor, and there's already space built in. I can further manipulate it in the table designer. Now, the first thing I need to do with this table is make it wider. So I'm just going to grab the sizing handle and stretch it all the way across the column. And then everything else I want to do is going to be part of the table style. So I'm going to go to Table Designer and I'm going to create a new style. I'm going to call it FT Figure Table and I'll click Create Style. And then I'm going to begin in Basic Properties. I don't need to have a table title, so I'm going to go ahead and set that to No Title and Update Style. And right here, it says table margins. That's the spacing that goes outside of the table. So there's 12 points above the table and 12 points below. That's fine. But again, I don't need a paragraph style to do that. It's built into the table style. Now, the second thing I want to do is adjust all the ruling properties, and I'm going to zip through these menus. I want to have a thin line on all four sides, and so I'm setting those up first. And then I don't want to have a line between the body rows and the heading rows. It's already set to none. And I don't want any interior lines in the table, so I'm making sure that all the rows and columns are set to none, and I'll update the style. But I still have some shading because that's the style for the data tables. So I'm going to go over to shading, and I'm going to change the fill value to none, update style, and that's exactly what I'm looking for. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to assign paragraph styles. I want this first cell to use a style called cell figure. That's part of the template. And then I'm going to click in the second cell and I'm going to assign figure caption. This is great. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to update my table style. Now you might think, well, why did you do that, Barb? You've just added paragraph styles. Why are you updating the table style? Well, this is a hidden feature of FrameMaker. FrameMaker can memorize the paragraph styles and put them in as part of the table style definition. It's not very well known. It's not talked about very much, but it is a feature of the software. It's a little confusing, so let me try to explain it. A table in FrameMaker can have three separate areas. It can have heading rows, it can have body rows, and it can have footing rows. Within each of those three sections, if you go to the top of the first column in each of those three sections and set the paragraph styles and then update your style, FrameMaker memorizes those and puts them in as part of the table style. So what we're doing here is we're saying, okay, in the header row, this should default to using cell figure because that's at the top of the header row column. And then in the body rows, we're saying figure caption. And when I clicked update style, that was telling FrameMaker to memorize it. It's kind of a cool concept. And then once I've done that, I can just go ahead and close the table designer and add my content. I'm going to go ahead and add my graphic, and I'll use my keyboard shortcut of Escape FIF. I'm looking for the wide spaceship. And of course, it anchors below insertion point and has a frame a little bit bigger. And that's because I reset my preferences after I showed you how to set them, so it went back to the defaults. I'm just going to shrink wrap it. With an anchored frame, shrink wrap is Escape MP. When you're working with a table with a column, you can shrink wrap the column using the shrink wrap button or Escape TW, or it's also an option in the table menu under Resize Columns. Two separate features, both called shrink wrap. That's a little confusing. So let me just mention that. And then down here, I'm just going to type in my caption. And there we have it. If I go and hide my borders and my text symbols, you can see now that the two of them are sitting inside a table with a border that goes around the outside. And of course, it's all anchored. So if I start to edit, it's going to move down and then it's going to come back. So that's great. That is the first example. And then I have one more example. For the final example in this webinar, I'd like to show you how to add an alert table. Alerts are often notes and things that are important and things to be aware of that we add to our documentation. Oftentimes they'll have a symbol to get the reader's attention. It might be an alert symbol or some kind of symbol that you've created, and you use that same symbol over and over again whenever you have that kind of an alert. You know that you can put graphics above and below a paragraph, but you can't put them to the side of a paragraph, and I get that question all the time. The alert tables solve that. I want a graphic to the side of my actual alert paragraph. So let me show you how that works. Now I'm going to keep my cursor at the end of this line right here. I'm not going to press the Enter key. I'll go to the table menu. I'm going to insert a table, and I'll pick the default TB table bordered again. This time what I want is 2 columns and 1 body row, no header, no footer rows, and I'm going to click Insert. Here comes my basic table. The first thing I want to do is resize the columns, and I'll do it by dragging, although honestly it's easier if I do it numerically by just typing in column widths, but give me a second here. What I'm going to do is, let's see, Control click so I can select that cell. I want that one to go here, and then I want this cell to span the main column. Almost there. There we go. That looks great. And then I want to create a table style. So I'm going to go to the table designer and I'm going to go ahead and call it alert table. And then I'll create the style. And I'm in basic properties right now. So I'll stay here for a moment because I don't want to have a table title. I'll go ahead and say title, no title, update style. And I think the spacing looks okay, but I did want to just point out that if you put a table margin top, I'll make it 24, which is twice as big as it is. It'll add space above the table as part of the table style. And the same thing for the bottom side. I'll put bottom at 24 and update style. And so I don't have to use a paragraph style to do that. Table styles have the ability for you to build the spacing above and below, and also left and right. Now from here, I don't want that blue vertical line, so I'll go to ruling, and this is a column ruling, so I'll just say first should be none, all the others should be none. There's only one, but that's fine. I'll update style, and that now looks the way I want. And then what I'd like to do is take advantage of assigning the paragraph styles in advance, like I did in the last exercise. So what I'm going to do is click in this first cell, and I'm going to assign AT alert table figure, which only centers it, makes it a bit bigger. That's it. And then I'm going to come over here, and I'm going to click on a style called note, which happens to be built into this document. There's note and there's tip. I'm going to use note here. And you probably know this already. It's been in previous webinars, but the word note appears because of numbering properties. If I go over to my paragraph designer and I look at my numbering properties, you can see the word note appears here. You can put whatever word you want. I'll just keep mine simple. And then I'm going to come back and click on this one over here, which is using alert table figure. Now I want to add a graphic here. So I'm going to go back over to the paragraph designer, and I'm going to go to advanced properties. And at the bottom of advanced properties, there are some drop-down menus. I'm going to choose frame above paragraph, and there's a bunch of choices in here. And I'm going to go ahead and just start with the danger symbol. So I'll say I want a frame above the paragraph. I want it to use a danger symbol, and I'll click update style, and it shows up. Now, I think that's probably too much space underneath here. So what I'm going to do is just reduce the size of that marker. So I'll go over to font and I'll go down to size 2, which is as small as I'm allowed, and I'll update style. And now it's tiny again, not taking up very much space. This all looks great. Now, I do want to make sure I go to the table designer and update that style because that's when it picks up that hidden feature I mentioned. And then I want to take you to where it found the alert symbol. So this alert symbol is not part of every FrameMaker document. I added it in here myself. That's actually a danger symbol. And these live on the reference pages. The last webinar we produced was webinar 9 of 10. It covers how to do this, but I'll show you now what I've got. I'm going to go to the view menu and head to the reference pages. And I've got a series of named frames. This is the one I chose. I chose the danger frame. It says danger down here. I have an alert frame. I have a high voltage frame. And I also have my aliens, which I'm very proud of because I created them myself in Illustrator from my own prompts. And somebody in the last webinar said that I work with scary documents. And so I thought, well, sometimes I do, and a lot of us do, right? But maybe we could have an alien in there instead. So I will point out while I'm here that this frame is called Waving Alien, and this frame is called Watching Alien, along with the alert icons. And once you know they're there, I'm going to head back over to my body pages, and I'll head back down to my table. And if I decide I want a different icon, I can just click in that cell, and I can come back over to Paragraph Designer, and I can change the graphic I'm calling in. I'll go to advanced and I'm going to be waving goodbye in just a minute. So I'm going to get the waving alien and update style. There we go. There's my note. So at this point, this document has 4 different styles set up. And we've worked with alert table and figure table and table bordered. I want to show you what I mean about that hidden feature one more time to make sure this is clear. So if I can find a spot to add a table, and I'll do it right here, let me go ahead and show my text symbols and my borders so you can see them. And I'm going to go ahead and just go to the table menu and insert a table. If I say that I want to have a figure table, it's going to remember in this document how many rows and columns I want. And those paragraph styles are part of the definition. So as that table shows up, you can see my paragraph styles are assigned. Here's cell figure, and here is figure caption. If I decide I want another alert table, I go to the table menu, I choose insert table. This time I pick the alert table, and when I click insert, it uses that table style, but also it assigns the paragraph styles. This is why I wanted you to make sure you remember to update your table style after you get your style set up. This impacts all future tables. It doesn't go back and change tables that are already in your file, but as you add more tables, those paragraph styles are getting assigned as long as you remember to update your style after you've assigned them. It's a pretty cool feature. So this completes webinar 10. The focus of this webinar was on working with anchored objects, specifically anchored frames and anchored tables, learning how to control them, and then how you can mix and match tables and frames together to get different FrameMaker effects. Thank you all for joining us. I hope I see you again at some point. If you want to stay in touch, here's my contact information. You know, I've got classes on Adobe FrameMaker. Just reach out if you'd like to take one. I wish everyone the best. Thanks, everybody. Bye.